Well, they started me off at 7 this morning, so if we turn the lights too low, you'll lose your speaker. So, it's very interesting how a person from a global environmental group comes to be talking at MSU about food and agriculture and the future. But the story is actually fairly short, brief, to the point. We've basically realized that everything we've done on conservation in the last 49 years will be undone if we don't fix food. If we don't get food production right in the next 40 years, there won't be much on the planet by way of biodiversity, by way of ecosystem services, by way of things that many of us care about. That means that instead of decrying the problems of food, we've got to find solutions. We've got to find how we can feed 9 billion people and maintain a living planet. So that's the mandate that I have within the organization that I work for. We've got about 400 people working on this globally. Falls into forestry because of packaging issues and paper. Falls into wild-caught fisheries. Falls into aquaculture. Falls into finance. Falls into climate change. Falls into agriculture. Falls into mining, also because of packaging. What I'd like to talk to you today about is what the problem is, how we're working on it, what we think the solutions are, and how we think about this issue. Because the one thing that I know for certain is whatever we think today won't be right tomorrow. So the issue is not what to think, it's how to think. How do we begin to solve these problems? How do we work? How do we find strategies that everybody can play a role in? So I did a lot of work in human rights and got real good at predicting body bag counts in refugee camps and famines and things like that. And I was talking to a farmer that was a refugee from Ethiopia and Sudan, and I said, why is it that you think the world doesn't realize that famines are actually made by people and governments and policies rather than nature? In fact, historically, we don't really know of any famines that were caused by nature. We know drought situations that were exaggerated by people, by policies, etc. And he looked at me and said, well, we have this saying where I come from, and it goes like this: you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. It's time that we wake up to the fact that we live on one planet. Population times consumption has got to equal the planet, and right now it doesn't. We're living beyond the planet. We publish every other year a report called the Living Planet Report. It's based on an index. It's been globally peer-reviewed, prepared by scientists, etc. And our research shows that by about 1988, we had reached the point of living sustainably on the planet. After that, we were living beyond the carrying capacity of the planet with the way we were using renewable resources unsustainably, etc. We're living at about 1.25, 1.3 planets today. So if you're a farmer, what that means is you're eating your seed. If you're a banker, you're eating the principal. We have got to figure out a way to make more from less. And maybe, in fact, restore parts of the planet that have already been degraded at the same time. So one of the things that this has led us to question is, should consumers have a choice about sustainability? Should you be able, as a consumer, to walk into a store and say, I want to buy that sustainable product, or I want to buy that unsustainable product because it's cheaper? On a finite planet, can we afford unsustainable products? Now, we can get scientists together to define what is sustainable or unsustainable, but should we be putting those kind of products on the shelf at all? And if you don't think we should, then companies shouldn't be buying unsustainable raw materials. If you take that logic further, then companies need to be working together on sustainability. Sustainability is not a competitive issue. It's not a differentiator on the shelf. We all depend on living within the means of this planet. It's a pre-competitive issue. If it's a pre-competitive issue, it would be great to see some collusion, wouldn't it, around sustainability. Getting Coke and Pepsi to work on greening in the orange juice industry, because they represent 80% of international trade in orange juice, and they're not going to have an industry in 10 or 15 years if they don't solve that problem. Neither one of it will solve them by themselves. So that's the kind of thing that we think needs to begin to happen. So today, the footprint of agriculture is bigger than any other human activity, agriculture and ranching, on the planet. It has had more to do with changing the face of the planet than anything else. We're using about 33% of the Earth's terrestrial surface area right now. But if you take out lakes and rivers and mountains and deserts and places we can't farm, it's up to 58%. If you take out 12% of the land that's in protection, national parks, protected areas, etc., that puts it up to 70%. So what we're talking about really is 30% of the land that's not being used today being up for grabs to help feed the next 3 billion people that are coming. So for the last 40 years, we've been expanding into natural habitat at a rate of 0.4% per year. But with the advent of higher development rates, higher incomes in some countries, we're now expanding at the rate of 0.6% for the last decade into natural habitat. If you do the math at 0.6% per year times 40 years, that's 24% of the 30% that's left. By 2050, there's not much left. So if we are going to get on top of this, we've got to figure out how to change that curve. Business as usual doesn't leave much of a planet left. In the last 150 years, we've lost half of the topsoil globally. It takes a little while to make topsoil. We won't be bringing that back right away. But bringing carbon into agriculture is one of the ways that we can actually proactively build up soil carbon, build up organic matter, make farms more productive, help solve part of the greenhouse gas climate change issue, etc. This is what worries us as environmentalists. These are the countries that have taken land out of protection in the last 100 years to make way for agriculture. We think this is going to accelerate. We think this trend is just the beginning, and it's going to become much more pronounced as we move forward. That's an issue for us if we want to have biodiversity on this planet. If we want to have representation of all the species, all the endemism, all the different ecosystem services that the environment provides, then we need healthy, natural places that are not used for other things. We can accommodate a lot of biodiversity in areas of human use, but we also need some areas that are not used by humans. Now, this map shows areas of water scarcity. And this, I might add, was a map that was created before biofuels. It was also a map created before some of the early pressures coming from increased consumption in India, China, Indonesia, Russia, Brazil, etc. And it is most assuredly a map that was created before we know what the impacts of climate change are going to be. We know that climate change is going to make weather and rainfall more unpredictable. So from a water point of view and a climate change point of view, what happens when you borrow money from a bank as a farmer and you have a drought and you can't pay it back? And the second year, you borrow money from a bank and put your crop in, and you have too much rain and the crop dies. These are both scenarios that are quite possible within 1 year to the other with more climate change. What bank is starting to think about multiple year loans as a way to reduce risk? That's the kind of thing we're going to have to get our heads around as we move into a world where climate change is going to make agriculture more unpredictable, production more unpredictable. So, on the water side, if you look at the first column, it's a column of common products. A t-shirt, a Coke, a Kraft single, a double quarter pounder. The second column is how much material at the farm gate was produced that it took to make that product. The third column was how much water, and it varies, that it took on the farm to grow that material that went into the product. The fourth column was how much the farmer was paid for that raw material. Now, if you look at how much they were paid, and you look at how much water it took, if you divide how much they were paid by the amount of water it took, is that a decent price for water in a water-scarce world? Is agriculture going to begin to pay? This, to me, is the perfect example of an externality. This means that right now we're not paying for water when we do agriculture. You pay to pump water, but you don't pay for the water. This is going to change as water becomes more scarce and as we start competing for water with industry, with municipalities, with human drinking water, etc. Now, what that means is if you're not paying for water, or soil erosion, or biodiversity and habitat loss, or other things, that probably the price of food is too low. And if you look at the US, which is the lowest in the world actually, we're paying about 9% of income for food. About 60% of that food is eaten at home, and about 40% is eaten out. We're not paying for the actual cost of producing that food from an environmental point of view. Let me just add, because I thought the next slide was going to say that, but it doesn't, that 1 billion people right now on this planet can't afford food at this price. And yet it needs to be higher if we're going to have a planet that we can still live on. We've got to be paying for these things that are now externalities. So that's one of the issues that has to be addressed. We've got to figure out both how food can be affordable to people who need it, but also how we can produce more and how we can actually cover the real cost of production of food, which we don't do today. Companies control less than 15% of the impacts of the products that they sell. Unilever did a study that looked at their carbon footprint. What they control in their factories is 1% of the impact. 60% of it is on the consumer side, either using hot water to wash clothes or take showers or to cook food, etc. And 40% is on the producer side. Walmart did a study. Their greenhouse gas, their footprint from a carbon point of view is 8%. They control 8% of the carbon. What that means is that these companies do not control the biggest impacts that are associated with the products they sell, but they're still responsible for them. So how do they work up their supply chain to begin to address those issues? How do they design their products down to the consumer so that they take less energy, they take less water, they're easier to get to, they're distributed with fewer impacts, etc. So WF has been on a journey for the last decade. We wanted to find out what are the most important places on the planet that we need to save, because they will provide the species variability, the ecosystem types, the ecosystem services that we all depend on. We came up with about what in the end was almost 250 different places on the planet, and some of these places are actually quite big, like the Amazon. And then we cut it down to 35 places where we thought we could actually work. In those 35 places then, we said, okay, what are the major threats that are coming to these places? What are the commodity production systems that are actually affecting biodiversity that we need to worry about? And this is just an example of the types of places, 5 of the places, and the types of threats that we documented. We went through that whole process and we found that there were 15 commodities that have the biggest impact on the places we care about. So wood and timber on the one hand, pulp and paper is 2, soy, sugarcane, palm oil, cotton, each for different reasons, and then dairy and livestock, whitefish, pollock, things like that, cod, etc., tuna, the forage fish, the tropical shrimp, and the salmon and shrimp from aquaculture. Those are the ones we focused on. What we begin to see is then we said, okay, so how do we affect these industries? And what we found, let me just go a little bit further here. As we looked at each of these industries, we have a question. Okay, so how do you want to affect this industry? Do you want to work with 1.4 billion producers of this product? Is that going to be easy to work with that many farmers? I mean, isn't that kind of what governments are supposed to be doing? Or somebody, but not really NGOs. That's not our competency. Are we going to work with 6.7 billion consumers? Are we going to educate consumers about choices in the grocery store when they spend 1.4 seconds making a decision? Or in a restaurant when they spend 15 seconds making a decision? And it really doesn't have much to do with sustainability in most cases. Are we really going to take on that task? Or do we want to work with the points in the middle, the processors, the traders, manufacturers, brands, retailers, and buyers, where there are fewer players? In fact, where there are 300 to 500 companies that control 70 to 80% of the trade of every single commodity. So we thought, that's where we want to work. That's where we can actually do something. 300 to 500 companies, that's a lot more doable than 6.7 billion consumers. Then we took the 15 commodities and lined them up side by side. And what did we find? Well, we found that, funny enough, Cargill starts showing up in a whole bunch of these commodities. Coca-Cola shows up in a lot of these commodities. Walmart's in every one of these commodities. What we found, or what we estimated initially, was that 100 companies control 25% of the trade of all 15 commodities. So if you want to change those commodities, work with those 100 companies. Since then, we've found that it's actually 50 companies that control 25%, not 100. We were way over in terms of our estimate. So we began to start working with those companies. We've now signed deals to work on supply chain, to work on carbon, to work on water, to work on packaging with 40 of the top 100 companies. And we've also are in line to have deals signed with another 40 in the next 18 months. These are just 9 of the different commodities, and these are some of the companies that are involved, and this shows where we are in terms of, this is a little out of date, but it shows where we are. Sorry, I have to keep turning around here, guys. So what we've found is that we need to engage with those market leaders. These are the big companies that have big market share in any specific commodity. Mars, for example, has 17% of global cocoa that they buy. About a year ago, we convinced Mars that they were only going to buy sustainable cocoa, third-party certified. They announced it publicly. The reason that 25% is such a magic number is that 25% of demand pulls 40 to 50% of production, because people compete to sell into those markets. And because of seasonality and different things around the world, 25% gets you almost half of the market. That's transformational. That will flip the whole market. Organics at this point is at 0.7 of 1% of global food. Which is going to change these markets? What are we trying to do here? We're trying to make them more sustainable around 6 to 8 key criteria. We've also got to move the middle. You know, working with the market leaders is one thing, but we've got to move the entire industry. We've got to develop consensus. What are the key impacts? What are the 4, 6, 8 things that really need to be improved, where we need to see a measurable improvement on performance? And each commodity is slightly different, but they're pretty much just a different sequence. They're all pretty much the same issues. Who are the innovators? Seventh Generation is an innovator within the product cleaning work. Starbucks is an innovator around coffee and cocoa sourcing. Domtar is an innovator around pulp and paper in Southeast Asia. And then we've got to work with the companies that don't want to work with us. Environmental NGOs have been cherry picking. They've been working with the companies that want to work with them. They've been working with some of the best companies. The worst companies are the ones that cause the impacts that we care about. The bottom 25% of producers and companies' performance is probably 50 to 75% of the impacts we care about. You cannot change the impacts on the ground by working with the best companies. You've got to change the worst. Working with the best companies, identifying and building consensus around global benchmarking criteria for performance allows you to identify what you want and what the 6 or 8 key variables are. Working with government helps you push the bottom along those same 6 or 8 criteria. And so that's our strategy at this point. And then there are place-based companies, companies that are not big globally, that are very important in some of our priority places. This is a shrimp production group in Madagascar, which is one of our priority places. And they're a very innovative company at the same time. So what we do with these companies, we help them undertake an assessment of where their risks are, where their opportunities are. For example, we were working with Mars, and we found that Mars was buying swordfish. Well, for those of you who don't know, Mars actually produces a lot of pet food. And a lot of pet food has seafood in it, especially for cats. Mars buys 4 times more seafood than Walmart does. But they're also buying swordfish, and we're sitting there. Swordfish is on every endangered species list. It's on every red list. You wouldn't really want to buy swordfish. This is a $40 billion company betting the brand on 10 tons of fish of any kind. I mean, what were they thinking? They weren't thinking. They'd never made the connection. So they're not doing that anymore. They've now made a commitment to purchase only third-party certified wild-caught seafood and aquaculture products for their pet food. And they've also made a commitment not to source human-grade seafood for pets. That's going to be a big issue as we go forward in time. So we help do assessment, we do strategy development, we help figure out what we can actually do in terms of supply chain practices, etc. And then we set targets. We set performance-based targets and timelines. The only protection we have against greenwashing charges is to have in the public domain credible performance-based targets. We will, for example, a company saying, we're going to work with World Wildlife Fund on sugar cane standards, and when those standards are established, by 2015 we will have 25% of our purchases coming from certified sources. By 2020 we'll have 75%, and by 2025 we'll have 100%. That kind of thing is a target, okay? By having those in the public domain, it lets people debate and decide and raise issues. Is this enough? Is this sufficient, etc.? But it lets us also take a little bit less heat from working with companies because we're putting everything we're doing out there in the public domain. So everything I've talked about is in a world of 6.7 billion people. But that's not what the world is going to be. The world is going to be 9.1 billion people by most credible estimates I've seen. 70% of those people are going to live in cities, and that's more people than are alive today on the planet. Okay, just think about that. So those people living in cities, business as usual, won't be producing their own food. But this is actually where Detroit comes in. Because if we can establish urban agriculture that focuses on nutrition in a place like Detroit right now, that could be a precursor for the kinds of cities we would like to see in 40 years' time. Now, I'm not talking row crops down the avenue in Detroit. I'm talking vertical agriculture using heat and water from power plants that is cogen and allowing you to produce high-value, nutritious, leafy crops, vegetables, etc., that can be sold into local markets fresh rather than shipped. Cities won't produce calories. They'll produce nutrition. 8 to 10 crops on the planet produce 90% of the calories, 80% of the calories that people consume. The rest come from hundreds of things that provide the nutrition. The calories are basically starches that are carriers for flavor and nutrition and other things. So the issue is how to think, not what to think. If you solve a problem today, that's great, but you'll never face exactly the same problem tomorrow. So we've got to change the way we think about food and solving problems. I just wanted to make it clear also that it's not just about terrestrial areas. This little progression shows how much we have overfished and how much we have pushed the fish stocks on the planet, so that 25% are overexploited, 52% are fully exploited by some bureaucrat's estimate. Many academics would actually argue with that. But at the best of cases, only 23% are somehow underexploited, and most scientists predict that within 30 or 40 years they will all be fully exploited. More importantly, the take from wild-caught fish has been pretty stable for the last 15, 20, 30 years. It's just pretty flat. All the increases have come from aquaculture. The green is aquaculture production. Last year, for the first year ever, aquaculture produced more seafood consumed by people than wild-caught fisheries on the planet. Aquaculture is the future of seafood. Getting it right is the challenge. Reducing the impacts, reducing the amount of feed that's used, finding species that are environmentally more benign. So pick your favorite one. They're all up, well, a lot of them are up there. But what aquaculture also shows is that production is shifting to developing countries. 80% of production is in developing countries, and this represents a protein drain because a lot of that is shipped to developed countries, because developed countries will pay more for that. A lot of food self-sufficiency in developing countries is being used, the income from the sales of high-priced fish is being used to buy and eat other products, but not the fish anymore. The fish are being sold to aging northern populations who want to eat more healthily and who can afford to do so. We all know who we are. Okay, so connections. If you look at the yellow line, that's the number of pigs in China. China has more pigs than the rest of the world combined. Those pigs eat a lot. China doesn't produce enough food for them. The reason China has so many pigs is because pork is the preferred meat, and when income doubles, people buy more meat. They don't go out and buy a car. They don't go out and buy a house. You can't afford those things, but you can afford a little more meat every week. And the little more meat they buy is pork. We could have predicted this, but nobody really did. So where is that food for the pigs going to come from? It's coming from Brazil. And if you look, the increased production of soy in Brazil is a pretty good parallel line to the increased production of pork. What's the impact of that in Brazil? Okay, this was a forest 10 years ago. This is the scale of farming in many parts of Brazil. The average soybean farm is 1,000 hectares. That's 4 square miles. Combined, right behind it, planted. 2.4 crops a year in this particular place. Combined, planted, combined, planted. Hard to compete with that. China is buying this. I was in Brazil when there was a delegation from China buying soy. And what they were very clear about with the Brazilians, we're buying soy and all this stuff, but actually we're buying soil and water. We don't have either. We don't have soil and water. So that's your comparative advantage. We manufacture for the world. We're going to use our dollars to buy your products. Another, how do you think about it? So where is the carbon footprint in food? To put it another way, if transport is the little red line on the left side, and wholesale, retail, and distribution is the little red line on the right side, and the big yellow part in the middle is how farmers produce food, that's where the carbon is, does buying local guarantee that you're going to be buying less carbon? Or let me put this another way. There's less carbon in a frozen leg of lamb shipped from New Zealand to London than grown in England and shipped to London. We got to get the metrics right. We can't just assume things. There are lots of reasons to buy local produce. You help local farmers, you want it fresh, etc. But let's not say that it's about carbon, because it isn't always. In fact, often it isn't. We got to do the math. It's not quite so simple. How to think. This is a product. A lot of you probably know this product. You might even know it intimately. Might try it every day, whatever. This is a grande latte. How much energy is in this product? How many minutes of labor does it take to make this product, from the coffee pickers to the growers to the cultivators all the way to the end use? How many greenhouse gases are produced to make this product? All of those questions are relevant. We don't know the answers to any of them. I'm going to talk about how much water it takes to make this product. So there's the direct water, the water in the coffee, the milk, the sugar, the paper, and the plastic. That lid is plastic. So one latte, the amount of water it takes is a tiny bit. It's just this much. I mean, if anybody has told you that Starbucks is a coffee company, they're dead wrong. Starbucks is a milk company. They sell more milk than they sell coffee. They buy more milk than they buy coffee, by volume and by value. They buy 2% of all the milk in the US. The lid has 2.5 liters. The cup and sleeve, 5.5 liters of water to make. The sugar, if you use sugar, about 7.5. The milk, a little bit more. And the coffee, a whole lot more. Because coffee is a tree. It grows all year long. It takes water whether it's producing coffee or not. It takes a few years to get to producing coffee. All of those things matter. Is all of this water equally important? No. We need to figure out which is. In this water scarce areas, water's important. You'd have to track it back to where these things came from. Is the sugar irrigated? Is the dairy abstracted? Is it from aquifers, etc. Those are the kinds of questions you'd need to know. Can a consumer change this? Can a consumer make a choice that's fundamentally going to change how much water is in the coffee they buy? No. Can a company fundamentally change this? Only if they can work with these two bottom supply chains, because that's where it is. That's where the water is. Incidentally, I use this a lot. We've got a little video about how much water it takes to make a latte. You can Google it, watch it. Sometimes it's about 90 seconds. It's all peer reviewed. It's very interesting. Every time I give this talk, Starbucks knows where I am because they start getting emails. I went out to meet with them, and we quibble about the data. Not too big, and actually in net it's about the same. It's just a little squished in different ways. They're using this now. Their proposal is to create a campaign to educate consumers about water, and using their product to do it, and putting this information in 9,000 stores and showing millions of customers every day what they're doing to change this. That is the power a company has, as opposed to an NGO, as opposed to an individual consumer. We have been trying to figure out how to educate consumers. They're reaching 9,000 times millions of consumers every day. We don't do that. In our entire 49-year history as an NGO, we've spent less money on conservation, raised and spent in that entire period, and we have a $500 million budget a year globally, than Coke spends on advertising every year. Who's going to win the hearts and minds of the consumer? Who's going to get their message across? We have to make sure that these guys are talking about the right issues in the right way. That's where we can actually have an impact. So you manage what you measure. You can't measure everything, so what are we going to measure? Well, we think we probably need to look beyond bushels per acre. We're really not convinced that that's the best measure we could be using. So what about tons of product per meter cubed of water? What about tons of product per unit of nitrogen? What about calories per hectare? That actually may be the most significant measure in a calorie-starved world where there isn't enough food for people. How many calories you can produce per hectare of any given crop may be a good way to evaluate which crops we should be supporting, which ones not. In that particular calculation, sugar is 2 factors more productive than corn in Iowa. The reject rate of bananas, 5% in Costa Rica, is equal to the best corn land in Iowa from a calorie per hectare point of view. 95, it's 20 times basically more. We need to start looking at what is producing the food that people on this planet need, and where is it produced? The food needs in the future are going to be in Africa and Asia. By 2050, Africa and Asia will consume as much food as produced today, just in those 2 places. And tropical crops are not going to be what they need. Excuse me, temperate crops. They need tropical crops, preferably tree crops, because those are going to be the most sustainable, and because those are actually sequestering carbon, and because they don't require soil tillage, therefore they have lower carbon volatilization, so they're better in a lot of different ways. How many companies are working on tropical trees? Count them on my fingers. None. How many companies are torturing temperate crops to try to get corn and soybeans to grow in the tropics? We're not solving the right problems here. So I've put together, and this has been vetted past a lot of people, but this is still very much a work in progress. You may have heard of the kind of energy wedges we need to pursue to get off of the petroleum kick that we're on. This is what are the food wedges we need to be pursuing simultaneously to feed and maintain the planet. Genetics. We cannot take genetics off the table, and we cannot take genetic engineering off the table. And by genetic engineering, I don't mean GMOs. I mean genetic engineering, where we're selecting for traits within a genome and helping enhance that. None of the tropical crops and none of the tree crops have ever benefited from that technology. In the old days, tree crops would take centuries to change. Now we can do it in a decade or 2. That's amazing. That's phenomenal. We should be doing that more. Better practices. The best producer of any commodity in the world is 100 times better than the worst for any commodity. The best country producer, on average, is 10 times better than the worst country producer. So do we make progress by moving the best a little bit, or by moving the worst a little bit more? We think we got to probably focus on both, but this side really needs to get moving. Technology, better irrigation, better use of fertilizers, better use of pesticides, more efficient. Most water is not taken up by the crop. 60% of water used today is wasted in irrigation. And we use 70% of all the water used by humans is used for agriculture. Underperforming lands. A lot of land is degraded and then abandoned, and farmers move on. This is the kind of moving agricultural frontier. We can go back and rehabilitate that now. We've documented farmers in Brazil and Borneo and Indonesia where they're producing soy and palm oil. The internal rate of return, the net present value of rehabilitating land, shows that it's more profitable on those lands than on forested lands. They make more money doing it that way. They're making more money growing soil in Brazil than they are growing soy. Because they buy land at 15% on the dollar that's degraded, abandoned, bad pasture. They build up the organic matter through no-till and through other practices, and they basically double the original price they paid for that land every year. For 5 years, to the point that it's worth more than the land of the neighbors. It produces more, and they use half the inputs because they've built up the organic matter to 3% soil carbon. That's the future of farming. We need to get on it. So I just wanted to back up some of the statements. This shows which crops are responsible for most of the calories consumed on the planet. I'm not really going to go through this in any detail. This shows, can you read this in the back? This shows what the percent rate gain per year is from genetics of the major crops that are used for food and fiber around the world. This is the global average, not the US average. But you see that sorghum has 11% growth rate. That is going to get us nowhere. I mean, this is, excuse me, a 0.11%, 0.1%. Anything that is not 2 or higher will not double by 2040, excuse me, 2050. So basically, nothing that we're working on, with very few exceptions, are going to get what we need. So how do we solve this problem? We have proposed to the 6 largest biotech companies that they take the approach of oil and gas companies. That instead of investing and choosing 1 or 2 crops to work on and putting everything on that and having a very high-risk operation, that they in fact focus on collaboration, a pre-competitive approach where they all work together and everybody owns any access to information created by any of the group. That means, as with the oil and gas companies, if you have 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 dry wells, you still have a few other wells that come in and everybody benefits. In this case, if you choose 1 or 2 crops that your company works on and nothing happens, you don't get anywhere, at least you can get access to whatever comes out of the other work. That will let us work together to begin to solve these problems, and we can focus on the tropical crops. Efficiency is an issue. 1970, we harvested about 30% of the live weight of fish in the form of fillets that were taken off, and the rest were thrown away. 2000, we harvested about 70%. I don't know how many of you know what surimi is. Surimi is the part of the fish that we used to throw away. Now we take fine mist jets and pop off all the meat off all the bones, and we take everything off the fish, and we get about 70% now. And the rest we grind up and we feed to other fish in aquaculture. So every single bit is used. So between 1970 and 2000, in whitefish, we doubled the amount of fish that came out without harvesting any more fish. Interesting. That only goes so far, though. So this is some data on global poultry. Jeff is not going to take issue with this, I'm sure. The Brazilian poultry industry asked me to help them develop standards, and so we looked at this. And the standard we came up with was, by 2015, they would have achieved 1.6 in a feed conversion ratio. They would have a mortality rate of 2%. The age to market would be 36 days. And the live commercial rate would be about 2.5. So that's what people have been managing around poultry for a long time. But you know, as you learn about sustainability, you have to start asking other questions. So how much water does it take to make a bird in Brazil and process it? Turns out it's 32 liters today to grow 1 chicken and process it for market. So the target on water is 16 liters, and they've already achieved that. They achieved that within 2 years of our discussion. How much fish meal and fish oil does it take to make poultry in Brazil? 0. They use yeast and byproducts. They don't use any fish meal or fish oil. How many antibiotics does it take? None prophylactically, because most of their exports go to markets that won't tolerate it. How many growth hormones? None. They don't use them. Because when you produce for markets that don't accept it, it's cheaper simply to run your entire operations the same way. So those are some of the types of standards that are being evolved. Better practices. This is a great little photo, or two photos, taken on the same day within a mile of each other. The soil types are the same, etc. The only difference here is management. Better practices make a difference. They really do make results on the ground. Higher carrying capacity, more wildlife, more water, etc. A lot more carbon. This is a map of degraded land. Depending on who you talk to, there's 300 million hectares to about 1.5 billion hectares of degraded land. There is significant degraded land, probably, we think, to produce maybe 10% of the calories we're going to need by 2050. Maybe 15 or 20 if you can get carbon markets moving, because carbon is going to make rehabilitation of degraded land a lot easier, because farmers are going to get paid for two things, basically. In Brazil, as I mentioned, they've actually, they're making more money growing soil than they are growing soybeans. And then when they build the land up to a certain level of full value, they can take that to the bank, borrow against it, and buy another small degraded land property and start all over again. So this kind of thing has generated 20 million reclaimed hectares in Brazil. That's the scale that this is already happening at. Now you might ask how they had 20 million hectares of degraded land, but that's another issue. What this means is that you could produce 2 to 4% more production per year for 25 years without cutting a tree. We've begun to work with agricultural companies, retailers, brands, etc., about how they can begin to buy carbon in their systems, and buy carbon as well as commodities. So they're buying two things from farmers rather than one. And it starts with the assumption that we've been buying different values a long time, and that the private sector actually set all these things up. Government came in and regulated these traits 20, 30, 40, 50 years afterwards. The coloring cotton wasn't designated by government until the 1930s. The yellow in yellow corn wasn't officially regulated by government until 1966. So governments are very slow to act on these standards. These are commodity trading companies that set these up. But we've got these other intangible values that are already being bought as well. Non-GM, if companies want them, organic, carbon, water, poverty alleviation, etc. If anybody has interest in this, I'd be happy to send it to you. We're running a little bit late here. So, I come from Missouri. This is a common expression. Where are we trying to get to with food? What's our goal? What's the future of food on this planet, of people on this planet, and other living things? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Question over here?
Yeah, I was a little concerned. The other day I had the opportunity to see this film, The End of the Line on overfishing. And in there they talked about what do you call farm fish?
Aquaculture, yeah.
Is that the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't have much hope for it, and you said that's the way to go. I was concerned about that. They said it took like twice as much fish from the ocean to feed those farm fish.
Farming fish has got to be done right, and we got to choose the right species to farm. But even with salmon now, which is one of the most carnivorous of species that are being grown, and that's what most people think about when they think of farm fish, there's 2 kilos of wild fish to make 1 kilo of salmon from aquaculture. And that's a trend that has gone from 4 to 2. in the last 20 years. So we see that trend actually coming down to 1-to-1 probably within the next 10 or 15 years and getting below 1-to-1. We think that's the trend, the way it should go. We don't think that's going to happen overnight, but we think if we work with the industry, if we find vegetable-based substitutes for feed, that can happen. But in the wild, salmon eat 8 to 10 kilos of fish to get 1 kilo of salmon. So we need to look at what we're talking about here, which has a bigger impact on different things. And salmon is the worst case. Salmon is less than half of 1% of global aquaculture production. Most aquaculture, so the two biggest categories are bivalves and, by weight, bivalves and seaweed that ends up in a lot of different products that you use, don't eat anything except nutrients in the water. They filter feed, or they feed through, in the case of seaweed, through their pores. But tilapia, catfish, those kinds of fish, those systems all produce more fish meal and fish oil than they consume. That's a good place to be. That's why some of the predictions are that by 2050, tilapia globally and pangasius or basa from Vietnam and catfish from the US, those kinds of whitefish from aquaculture, will equal poultry production globally. And after 2050, they will surpass it, because they will produce the same amount of protein with half as much input. But we've got to get aquaculture right. But again, remember, the place that we are with agriculture, and talking about agriculture impacts, that's after 6,000 years. Aquaculture globally has really only been practiced about 40 years. So we're on a steep learning curve. That's why we got to get it better. But we can, and we think a lot of aquaculture production is better. We're in the process of, by the end of this year, we'll have standards for 12 different species of aquaculture that are globally kind of created, peer-reviewed, vetted, etc. And they will be the basis of a certification program like the Marine Stewardship Council, the Forest Stewardship Council, etc. You managing this?
Yeah, I'll try. We'll do quick questions and quick answers, maybe.
I noticed that you hit on the production aspect having the largest footprint, and two of those were dairy and beef. So if we're going to start measuring our production, not in bushels per acre, but let's say calories per a liter of water or stuff, wouldn't tools like RBST make sense, where our efficiency tools that use less manure, better feed conversion rates, less water, we're kind of, seems like to me if that's our ultimate goal, we're going backwards by not being able to use those tools.
Well, I think the one thing about food is you're going to have consumers and countries that are going to dictate terms of what they want to buy, and that's a given, and you can't get around that. So you can't just argue over that kind. Monsanto's been trying to do that for a decade. It hasn't really worked very well in Europe. But I think the bigger issue is that, at least in the terms of the animal debate, animal protein represents 8% of the calories that humans on the planet consume. There's a lot of discussion about 8% of the calories that's been going on around animal protein. Beef is 1.3% of the calories that are consumed on the planet. Pork is twice as much globally. So it seems to me that we got to get real about where the problem is and where the solutions are. We just need to be doing the math. We need to get back to the data and use the data as the guide. Of the beef that's produced globally, what percentage would you estimate is not grass-fed? Globally.
Not grass-fed?
Not grass-fed.
Let's say 40%?
10 or 15. 10 or 15% of the beef globally is in CAFOs, of the kind that you would see in the US commonly. Most beef globally is grass-fed. So that has another whole set of issues around it. And I think a lot of people are letting emotion and ideology and other things guide discussions where we need science to be guiding these discussions. And we might disagree about the issues, but let's at least use data in the argument and figure out where we're going to get the biggest gain. We did a little analysis of what would happen if people who are consuming too many calories stopped consuming by 25% the current levels of calories they consume. That would provide a 5% solution. Okay, so that's a big issue. Personally, it's a big issue from a healthcare point of view, etc. But in terms of providing the calories, that's not a big issue. 1 in 3 calories never hits the consumer. It's wasted. In developing countries, it's post-harvest losses, it's infrastructure, it's mildew, it's bad storage, it's lack of refrigeration. In developed countries, it's post-consumer. You throw it away. The restaurant throws it away. You go to your refrigerator, you open the door. Is that food still good to eat? I don't know. Man, if you had a $100 little machine like one for diabetes or that you could check, think what that would save in terms of lost food. You know, we can solve these problems, but we got to figure out where the leverage point is. There's a lot more food to be gained by stopping the waste than there is by changing the consumption patterns. Both are important to focus on, and both are useful, but let's make sure that we got the right metrics.